Okay, so we're on Lamites Amud Aleph, a few lines before the Mishnah. Bao Mine. So there's a teku, and the last two words on the line is Bao Mine, about 15 lines down from the top. Bao Mine Rabbi me Abai. Bao Lavan Isar Samahu. Rabbi asked Abai, if a person raped a woman, was ma'aneser, and then she became engaged, what's the before they took him to Beis Din, what's the din? Because we learned cases that if she died before he went to Beis Din, he doesn't have to pay the 50 shekel, because the pasuk says la avia nara. We have a gzera, the father of the last of the maiden gets the money, but not if she passed away. So what about if she is now married at the time? Because the pasuk only says that if she is not engaged, meaning if he would come be rape her and she was engaged, she gets a death penalty. He gets skila. If she was not engaged, that's our halacha, and the man would pay 50 shekels. But what if she got engaged before? When we say engaged, her father accepted kedushin to marry her off to someone. What's halacha? Amarle miksi v'nasan levi anara asher lo arusa. Does it say you will give it to the father of the maiden who is not engaged? No. So even though she got engaged before they took him to Beis Din, he still pays. But then where it says according to your reason, Haditanya, the brisa that says Ba'ala v'nises la'atzma, that if in the meantime she had gotten married, she gets to keep the money. Miksi v'nasan levi anara asher lo nesua. Did the pasuk say that he will give the fine of the 50 shekel to the father of the girl who is not married? So the Gemara doesn't like that response. Hachi hashta hasam holu ba'agrus motzim reshusav and asur motzim reshusav, because we mentioned what if she becomes a bogeres? That's what we were talking about last time. So a bogeres is 6 months after naros. So when she becomes a bogeres, she's no longer under the father doesn't have control of her anymore to marry her off. So since if she reaches the state of bogeres, she is no longer under the control of her father. And if she gets fully married, the two stages of eris and nesuin, she is no longer under the control of her father. Just like if she became a bogeres before the time he raped her, then she became a bogeres, and then they took him to Beis Din, she gets to keep the money. According to your logic, if she got married in the meantime, then she would be able to keep the money. But so the question is, Ella Erison mi kamafik mershusa da avlagamri, but in regard to only Erison, so that's only the first step of marriage, receiving the money or a star, but not having chuppah. Does that take her out of the control of her father completely or not? Hatnan, we learned in the Mishnah, Nara Marasa, Avia Ubala Mafirin La Nidareha, that engaged Nara, her father and her husband annul her vows. So because both of them annul her vows, she is partially removed from her father's control, but she's partially not, because since her father retains partial veto over any vow that she would take, so we would say that she's still under the domain of her father. So if she got kedushin in the meantime, the father would keep the money, not her. Okay, Mishnah, Lamed Tesamad Aleph. The man who seduces the young woman gives three payments for three different things, but if he raped her, he gives payments for four things. He gives her, he has to pay for her being humiliated and for her decrease in value and the 50 shekel fine. And a man who rapes, additionally, he pays those three plus tsar, the pain. And then the Mishnah says, Ma bein onus and mefateh, onus nosen and satzar, but mefateh in nosen and satzar. What's the difference between onus and mefateh? The onus, if he raped her, he pays for her pain, and if he seduced her, he does not pay the pain. Now, this line in the Mishnah does not seem to add anything. To the previous line, the Gemara doesn't talk about that. Ha'ones nosen miyad, v'mefateh l'shayotzi. If he raped her, he has to pay the 50 shekel immediately. If he seduced her, he doesn't have to pay the 50 shekel unless he divorces her. Unless even though the Gemara is going to say they're not married yet, but if they would get married, he doesn't pay the 50 shekel. But if they would not remain married, then he would have to pay the 50 shekel. So both halachos pay 50 shekel, but there's a big difference of when they pay it. Ha'ones shows about tzitzo, the one who rapes, he's stuck drinking from his bowl, meaning the halacha is that the Torah says that if he raped her, we spoke about this last week, that he has to marry her. So even if he didn't want to marry her, but because he was ma'anis her, he's kind of stuck. So he has to stuck drinking the potion that he made for himself. But if he seduced a man who seduced her, if he wanted to divorce her, he's allowed to divorce her. So what does it mean? He's stuck drinking the cup that he prepared for himself, even if she's lame, she's physically handicapped that she can't move too well or at all, even if she's blind, even if she has mukashchin, which according to most opinions is terrible skin maladies that people don't want to go anywhere near. So he's stuck. B'Yisrael eino rashai, excuse me, I skipped the line. Nimtza b'davar erva o she'eino ruya lavo b'Yisrael. But if she did something, a bad thing, a davar erva, which would be a divorceable offense, or she's not allowed to marry a kosher Jew. For example, if she was a mamzeres. So since you're not allowed to be married to one of those type of people, then he's not allowed to stay married to her. So meaning, obviously, she can't become a mamzeres later, but if he raped her and she was a mamzeres, he's not allowed to be married to her. Because the drasha is, she will be a wife to him, so the drasha is leisha isha haruyala. It has to be a wife who is fitting for him, but not someone that there's an avera to be married to. Gemara tsar demai. So what is the pain that the rapist pays? Amar vod Shmuel tsar shechaved al gabi karka. Shmuel says it's the pain that he struck her on the ground. According to that, if you put her on a pile of silk cloths, the silk cloths are very comfortable. Or if it was in a pillow shop and she was on all these pillows, it's not on a hard floor, it's comfortable. So according to that, to avoid the Shmuel's answer, the rapist wouldn't have to pay in that case. So and if you think that that's true, that you wouldn't have to pay, he wouldn't have to pay tsar in that case. Vatanya, but we learned in the Brisa, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Amar Mishum Rabbi Shimon, Onis and Mishalim Esatzar Bipnei Shasofa Lead Star Tachas Baila. So there's a Brisa that Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda sent the name of Rabbi Shimon, that the rapist does not pay for the pain because she's going to have pain again when she gets married from her husband. So Rashi says if the pain here is for being thrown on the hard ground, she's not going to be thrown on the hard ground when she's married. She's going to have a bed. So Amrulo Eino Dom and Velas Baonis and Velas Baratso. So they said no, there's a big difference. It's a difference when you're forcibly taken versus when she would be with her husband out of her own free will. Ela Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba Baravua. So Rav Nachman gives a answer in the name of Rabba Baravua. Tsar shel pisach raglayim. It's not of forcing her to the ground, but it's for spreading her legs. V'chein hu omer, and similarly the pasuk says in Yecheskel, Vatifaski es raglayich l'chol over. It's talking about where they're in the Navi Yecheskel is criticizing Bnei Israel the way that she's separating her legs for anyone who passes by. So then where it says Ihachi mefutanami, the seduced maiden. So her legs were spread apart also. So how come the seducer doesn't have to pay her the amount for her pain? Amar Rav Nachman Amar Bar Ravua. So Rav Nachman Amar Bar Ravua, the same person who gave the answer 3 lines above, said Mashal de Mafuta Lamad Davar Domer. A parable for the Mafuta, the seduced girl. What is it similar to? La'adam Shamel Chaver Crash Shirayin Shaliv Vehefater Vehipater. If you tell someone, rip my silk cloths, and you won't have to pay anything. So it's true that in the case of the seduced girl, something is happening to her, but since she's being seduced, so even though it wasn't her idea, but she's going along with it, she's consenting, so she is in effect she's being mefateh. She's saying that she doesn't need to be paid for it. She doesn't mind any pain that's going to happen from it, because we're talking about tsar. So then the word says shali, her own cloths of silk, davuninhu, because she's still a nara, her father's the one who can marry her off and make the money, not her. So the mashal isn't perfectly isn't a good mashal, because she's not the balabas who's going to be losing potential money for not being a basula anymore. So Ela Amar Rav Nachman Amar Baravua Pikchos Sheben Omros Mefuta Ein Latzar. The pikchos, the sharp thinking women said that the answer is that a seduced woman does not have pain. But the Gemara says we see that she does have pain. Amar Rabbi Amrli Aim. Abai said, my mother said, and it wasn't really his mother, but he was orphaned. So the woman who raised him, he quotes her sometimes from things that he heard her say in the Gemara. So she said, the pain that this seduced maiden would feel is like pouring hot water on the head of a bald person. Rava Amar Amrli Bas Rav Chisda. Rava says, the daughter of Rav Chisda said to me, and that was his wife. Rava's wife was the daughter of Rav Chisda. Kirivda de Kuslita. It's like the thing that the bloodletter pokes a hole in you, because in those days they felt that an important part of medicine was having your blood let. So the needle or whatever it was that they would open up the vein to bleed you, that's what it felt like. So there's a prick, a pinprick, or a little bit more than a prick, but people voluntarily undergo that pain for their blood to be let. So it's not a massive pain. Rapapa Amar Amrali Bas Abasura, the daughter of Abasura. So Rashi also again tells us that's Rapapa's daughter. Rapapa's wife was the daughter of Abasura. Now, Surah, I wonder if that's from the city of Surah. Probably. So it's talking about Abasura. Ramosha said mentioned somewhere, I don't remember who this Gemara is, but there's a Gemara that there's a Hebrew name, Abba. Abba means father, but it's not too common nowadays, but you do still come across people whose name is Abba or something like Avram Abba. There are some people named Abba, but there's a Gemara that said that there's a whole cemetery of people named Abba. So at a different time, it was a more popular name. So maybe because there were so many Abbas, he mentions Abba Surah, if he was from Surah, to help narrow down which Abba he's talking about. But obviously it was his father-in-law he's quoting, or his father-in-law's daughter, meaning his wife. It's like hard bread against your throat. So the pain when you're swallowing hard bread, that's what the pain is like. So it's nothing, I mean, you may want to avoid it, but it's not something that you're going to sue someone if you feel that much pain. So now we're almost halfway down again. I'm almost halfway down the page. There's the 2 dots in the middle. So the rapist has to pay the 50 shekel fine immediately. The seducer when he divorces her. So the Gemara asks, why does the Gemara say when they get divorced? Is he married yet? No, that was the whole problem. He seduced her and they weren't married. So Amar Abai. So Abai says, read the Mishnah of saying, if he doesn't marry her, then he has to pay the 50 shekel. We have a brisa like this. There's a brisa that says even though they said that the seducer pays her when he doesn't marry her, meaning the 50 shekel, the boshus of gam nosin miyad, the amount for her humiliation, her embarrassment, and for her devaluation at a physical level, that he has to pay immediately. Meaning, so even if he would decide, so right now he say, I'm going to marry you, so he still has to pay the boshus of gam, but he doesn't have to pay the 50 shekel yet. But then if a few months later he says, no, I really aren't going to marry her, I'm not going to marry her, so then he pays the 50 shekel fine. So Rashi points, it's not just if he decides not to marry her, but if she says, I don't want to get married to him, or her father says, I'm not letting her be married to him. So then once the marriage is not going to happen, then he pays the 50 shekel fine. Now the Gemara is going to talk about in a few lines about who has right of refusal and how do we know that. The echad ha'ones, I guess we're still in the middle of a brisa. The echad ha'ones v'echad ha'mefateh bein hi uvein aviyah yecholin la'akev. And whether it was a rapist or a seducer, the young woman or her father, either of them are able to say to refuse for the marriage to take place to the man. So bishlam mefuteksiv imaini aviyah. We understand why the father and the young woman have the right of refusal to marry the seducer, because the pasuk says, if he surely refuses, it's a double verb, definitely refuse. Now, where did I see it? Was it in the Gemara last week? No, it was the Gemara in Kedushin in the first parak. Ain law, ayin law, like daf hey or something. Rashi seems to say, and Kedushin daf hey, that the word me'ain, which we translate as refusal, is really the same word as ain. At least on a drasha level, it's the same word as ain, not having. So me'aini me'ain, we say they refuse to get married, but if they're not going to be married, but that's so they make a drasha from ain with a yud, ain without a yud. But here the drasha is because of the repeated word me'aini me'ain. You'll surely refuse is what we would say in English, but in the double verb ain li'ela avia hiatzma minayin tamal omer yima ain mikamakom. So the pasuk says if the father will refuse. So if it would have just said if the father refuses, that shows that if the father refuses, then they're not allowed to get married. How do we know that even if the young woman refuses to get married to him, that the marriage won't happen and you have to pay the 50 shekel fine? Because of the double verb ma'ain yima'ain. So yima'ain, it will be refused, kind of passive. It said that's not the pashut of the kra, but the drush is yima'ain, the second verb mikamakom, for whoever it gets refused. And how's it going to be refused if the maiden herself refuses? Alaones, but in the case of a rapist, bishlama ihi we understand why she's allowed to reject the marriage, because the pasuk by the rape says, velosia leisha, to him she will be a wife, tachas asherina, in place of, because of he had relations with her. So because it says velosia leisha, to him she will be a wife, we learned that it has to be midaita. It has to be from her own consent and own knowledge. So that's how we know that she would be able to refuse to be married to him. Ela via minala. But how do we know? What's the source in the pasuk that her father is allowed to refuse the marriage to take place? Rabbi, in order that a sinner is not able to profit from his sin. We saw this principle a week or two ago. So basically, the reason here, the logic of the Shlosh Yechote Niskar is, let's say, because she's a Nara, so she's not able to marry herself off yet. Her father is the one who has to marry her off. So let's say that Shmerel, this rape, let's say he wanted to marry her, and the father said, he went to the father, said, here's $100, I'd like to marry your daughter. The husband says no. So what does he do? Shmuel is a creepy guy, so instead he rapes her because he knows halacha is that if he rapes her, she's allowed to get married to him, and he thinks that she is willing to marry him. So now, if the halacha would be that the father doesn't have right of refusal, it ends up by this guy doing this sin of raping her. He's getting a chance to marry her, which he wasn't able to get without the rape. So, which is not a good thing. So he would be benefiting from this sin. That's Abaye's answer. So it's a svara from a principle of shlo yechote niskar. Rava Amar Kavachomer. Rava gave a different answer to Kavachomer. Ma mefateh shlo avar el dasavia bovad bein hu vein avia chon la'akev. If the seducer, so he seduced her, so by definition, she wasn't opposed to it. So if the seducer, who he didn't violate her wishes, because since she was seduced, she consented, but the father didn't consent, still in that situation, the maiden and the father are able to stop the wedding from happening after the seduction takes place. A rapist who is acting against the wishes of the young woman and against the wishes of the father, certainly either the father or the maiden are allowed to refuse the marriage to take place, not give their consent. So now the Gemara says, Rava lo amar kabaye keva de kamashalim knas lav chote niskarhu. Rava doesn't use Abaye's answer that the sinner shouldn't benefit because he's not benefiting, because he does have to pay the 50 shekel fine. So he's out some money. So he's not only benefiting from it. It's true he might be getting a wife, but he also has to pay this money. So it's not a case of coming out winning, getting in a better situation just because you did the avera. Yeah. You don't have this? No cocoa? You want me to put it on the table for you? Okay, so that's why Rabbi doesn't say like Abaye. But what's the reason that Abaye says Shoyechot Niskar and doesn't say like Rava's Kavachomer? Amar Abaye, this is the fourth wide line. Abaye lo Amar Karava, mefateh di'ihu matzi ma'akev, aviyunami matzi ma'akev. Abaye doesn't say like Rava because the seduced case, since because in the case of mefateh, the seducer, the man is also able to say, I don't want the marriage to go through. As we saw Rashi said a few lines above, or the Gemara is going to say it next. But since in that case, the man can also refuse, he's the one who caused the whole trouble by seducing her. Since he can also refuse, clearly the maiden can refuse and her father can refuse. But onus the ihu lo matzi ma'akev, aviyonami lo matzi ma'akev. However, in the case of the rapist, just like he's not able to say he doesn't want to get married, so her father also doesn't have a right to refuse the marriage. It's only up to the maiden. Tanya Idach, we have a brisa, a different brisa that says Afa Pisha Amru Ones Nosen Biad. So this is a very important halacha. Well, I mean, it shouldn't happen, but it actually doesn't look like we. Even though the Mishnah says that a rapist has to pay the 50 shekel immediately, Kishayotzi hu ein la alav klum. If they would get divorced, which it would be an avera, but if they would, ein la alav klum. She doesn't have any claim against him. So the 50 shekel that he paid her is basically in place of a ksuva. So it says when he divorces her, but is he allowed to? He's not allowed to. That's an avera for him to. Now, it just happens to be that this is an avera that you don't get lashes for. because there's a principle that a negative commandment that has a positive commandment to fix it, you don't pay for it. So, example, if you steal, you don't get lashes, even though it's a negative commandment, because there's a mitzvah of Heshav Exela. There's a mitzvah to return the stolen object. So you don't get lashes for stealing, even if you can't pay it back. But if you can't pay it back, you could be sold as an Eved Ivri. So even though there's an Avera for him to divorce her, he could always remarry her and unsend her away. So it happens to be there's no Malchus if he does, but it's an Avera too. So Mimotzi Mafikle. So Aimer Kishatetze he. So say that when she decides to leave, so he's not allowed to divorce her, but if she says, I don't like this marriage, I'm leaving, and Rashi says she left from her own accord and she went to Beis Din and says, I demand that my husband gives me a get, in that case, he doesn't have to pay ksuva. Mace, Yatsa Kesef Knasa Big Ksuvasa. But if he died, so the 50 shekel fine that he gave her all the way at the beginning, that takes the place of her ksuva. So the fine that he pays ends up working as the same effect as the ksuva. He doesn't have to pay ksuva because of it. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Omer, Yesh lo ksuvasa mana. And the second opinion in this brayso, so that was the Tanakama, and Rabbi Yossi, Bar Yehuda, he says that she still has a ksuva of 100, like a divorced woman or someone who's not a virgin. So, by my commitment, what's the machlokas between the Tanakama who says that she doesn't have a ksuva and Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda who says she does get a ksuva when he raped her and then they're married? Rabbanan Savri time amai takina Rabbanan ksuva kadesh lo te kalava enav lotzia. The Rabbanan hold what's the reason that the Chachamim instituted a ksuva? It's so that it won't be easier for him to divorce her. He has this important financial obligation upon himself if he would divorce her. So the ksuva is in effect the defense mechanism so that he shouldn't impulsively divorce her. He'll have to pay. But in this case, because there's already a lo saseh, because the pasuk says there's already an avera that he's not allowed to divorce her, that's enough of an impediment that he's not going to divorce her hastily. And so he's not allowed to divorce her. This is kind of interesting because in the tzedakah of the sugi of tzedakah in Bava Basra, there's a halacha that Beis Din isn't allowed to force someone if the reward for it is given in the pasuk. And Rav Aaron explained it in a beautiful explanation that why does Beis Din force you to do something? Because they need to make you know that you have to do the right thing. But if something is already explicit in the pasuk, like kibbut of aim, the pasuk says you get a long life. For tzedakah, it says you give a long life. So if someone is refusing to do kibbut of aim or refusing to give tzedakah, Beis Din doesn't. But if someone is refusing to put on tefillin, there is no reward mentioned in the Torah explicitly for putting on tefillin. Then Beis Din can hit you and say you have to put on tefillin, you have to do this mitzvah. So that's because they're trying to motivate you to do the mitzvah. I mean, they could use negative techniques like hitting. It doesn't have to be persuasive techniques. But when the Torah already gives the reward for that mitzvah in the Torah, that's already a persuasion. So Beis Din does not resort to hitting you to convince you to do the mitzvah. You already have a deal you can't refuse. The reward that's listed in the Torah is the deal you can't refuse. So Beis Din doesn't have to give you their deal that you can't refuse. Lahavdil. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Savar Haninami Mitzar La Adamra. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda says, true, there's an Avera, but let's say we already know that he's not the greatest human because he raped her, so he might make her life very difficult to try to convince her to leave and then to request a divorce. So since he can act in a way that he will be causing her to ask for a divorce, so we still need a defense mechanism to try to save her from him divorcing her. So there still is a ksuva. Second to last line in the Gemara Lamed Tes Amud Beis. Onus shosabat tzitzo. So the Mishnah said that if a rapist, he's stuck drinking the cup that he made, that he has to marry her even if she has severe physical deformities that would make living with her difficult. Amarle Rava mi Parzakia, Rav Ashi Rava from Parzakia said to Rav Ashi, Michti Migmor Gemiri Mahadadi. Since the case of ones, of rapist, and the case of seducer, the mefateh, we learn from each other that it's the amount is 50 and that it has to be silver. Since we learn the halachas from each other, as we turn to Lamed to Mem Amid Aleph, Laham Milsa Nami Ligamru Me'adadi. We should also learn this halacha to say from each other to say that the seducer is also required to marry her and is forbidden from divorcing her. So Amar Kra, the pasuk says Mohari Marena Lo Leisha, Lo Midaito. No, because in the case of the seducer, it says Mohari Marena Lo Leisha, they shall hurry or rush to. Well, okay, so I think we mentioned this a few weeks ago, or even last week. So the word maher can be can mean quick, but I think we mentioned last week that the Torah Tmima. So the Torah Tmima, in an essay called Safal and Amanim, says that there are some Aramaic words in the Torah. We mentioned it last week about a possible Persian word in the Torah, I think. But Mohor Yimharena, the art scroll here translates that Mohor, because there's a pasuk Mohar Habasulos, and Mohar Habasulos is basically the going rate for a basula, for a virgin. So the way the art scroll, I don't know why in the Gemara here is not translating that we will hurry up that to get them married, that he will be. So lo midaito. So it has to be by his consent. So this pasuk explicitly says by mefateh that he has to consent with it. So that's why we can't learn from the Gzera Shava or the limud between mefateh and ones that the seducer has to learn, because it would be against the pasuk. But what we're saying is that mohar basulos is also the going rate for a basula. So for whatever reason, the article Gemara here translates mohar. Well, I don't know if they vowelize it right here, but mohar yimarenda lo isha. Basically, the article translating is that the marriage, they say the marriage settlement must be prepared or provided. He shall provide her with a marriage settlement to be a wife for him. I mean, just because of the nouns and the verbs. So grammatically, it might make more sense. Mari Marenha will make sure hurry her up low to him to be a wife. The way that but the way they translate, because Mohar Yim Harenha, you provide a marriage settlement to her lo leisha, that she'll be a wife for him. Okay. Kate said Shosabat Tzitzo. So Kate said Shosabat Tzitzo. Amar. So the Gemara says, what does it mean that he's stuck drinking the cup he made? So if she's a mamzeres, he's not allowed to marry her because she's to be a wife as long as it's mutter to be married to her. Amar Rav Kahana, Amrito Shveitzk made Rav Zvid bin Narda. Rav Kahana said, we said the sugya in front of Rav Zvid from Narda. So there's a principle, and this is, I think, a big discussion in the first parak of Sanhedrin, of Yavamos, that if there's a conflicting positive commandment and negative commandment, we say that the positive commandment overrides the negative commandment. So, for example, this may not be the best example because there's a special limud. In last week's parsha in Kitetse, we saw that there's a pasuk that says you can't wear shatnez, wool and linen together, and the next pasuk says gedilim tasala. You have to put tzitzis on the corner of your clothes. Now, I know Rabbi Yashaber has a yard site share that there's different mitzvahs of tzitzis, because we know that the parsha of tzitzis is the last parsha of Kriya Shema that we say, and this is just talking about Gedilim. So on some halacha, there's, if you would, so because there's two different, Rav Yashabir, in general, he seems to use this principle a lot when he gave shir. If the Torah mentions halacha in two different places, there's two different aspects of the mitzvah. So the parsha of Shema, of tzitzis that we say in Shema, that's if you're wearing a clothes, you can't wear clothes that don't have tzitzis on it. But if I have a four-cornered garment, I'm allowed to take out the tzitzis. I don't need to put tzitzis in it if I'm not going to wear it. But from the parsha of Gedilim Tasalach, there's a requirement that even if I'm not going to wear the clothes, Gedilim Tasalach ala brakan fos Kesuvos. If you have a four-cornered garment, you have to put tzitzis on it, even if you're not wearing it. So that's a separate part of tzitzis. So maybe what I'm saying doesn't work 100% because it's talking about a different aspect. But the halacha is you're allowed to wear tzitzis that are shatnez. You have a linen four-cornered garment. You're allowed to put, not just allowed, you should put woolen tzitzis strings into that four-cornered garment, even though having the wool strands in the linen garment is shatnez. It's wool and linen together. But in general, asay dochel also say the positive commandment of having tzitzis nullifies or overrides, it wouldn't nullify, but it overrides the negative commandment against shatnez. So in this case, we have a negative commandment that you're not allowed to marry a mamzeres, but we have a positive commandment that he has to stay married to her. So why don't we say the regular rule that asay dochel also say, so the mitzvah asay that he should be married her should push aside the negative commandment of marrying a mamzeres. So Amar Li, he answered to me, Hey Chamrina Nesi Asay V'Nitchi Losa Say Kagon Mila B'Tzaras Lo Efshel L'Kiyum Eila Asay. He said, when do we say that a negative command, the positive commandment pushes off the negative commandment? That's, for example, if a baby has a tzaras on the tip of his orla, where you have to do bris milah. So there's an avera that you're not allowed to cut off a tzaras to try to avoid being a paskin tameh by a kohen. But if in order to do the bris milah, you have to cut off the tzaras, so the bris milah will take precedence over the avera of tzaras. But here, if she says she doesn't want to be married to him, does he have the asay at all? So it seems that bris milah has to be done. So in that case, it's asay dochel asay. But here in this case of that he's not allowed to divorce her, since there's a halacha that if she refuses to get married, they don't get married. So it's not an asay that has to be done 100% of the time, because if she wouldn't have a consent, if she wouldn't agree to marry him, they wouldn't get married. So therefore, the principle of asay dochel asay does not apply. Okay, we're at the Mishnah on Mem Amud Aleph. We're going to continue the first Mishnah on Mem Amud Aleph. Yisoma shenisarsa v'nisgarsha. The Gemara points out this Mishnah is out of order, but the Gemara puts it here because it's saying another difference between a case of onus and mefateh. So Yisoma shenisarsa v'nisgarsha. Orphan girl, meaning at least from her father. It's possible that her mother's still alive. That if she became engaged but then got divorced from the Arison, Rabbi Elazar says Rabbi Elazar says that one who rapes that girl, he has to pay the 50 shekel, but one who seduces her is exempt because there is no father. So Rashi says, if I'm understanding correctly, since she's seduced, she is, so this, we had the logic on the previous Amud that we had a mashal, which was pushed off a little, but if someone says, here, take my expensive silks and rip them, you're exempt from paying it because you ripped it with permission. So since she allowed herself to be seduced, she's being mochelas, she's foregoing the 50 shekel fine. That's what Rabbi Lazar is saying. Gemara, Amar Rabba Bar Barchana Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Lazar, Beshitas Rabbi Kiva Rabba Amra. Rabbi Lazar here follows the opinion of his Rabbi Akiva. The Amar, because Rabbi Akiva said, we learned this in the Mishnah above, and Lamed Ches Lamed Beis, Lamed Ches Lamed Aleph. Yesh la knas uknas la atzma. He says that such a girl receives the knas, but the knas belongs to her. So mai. How do I know that? Rabbi Lazar learns this from Rabbi Akiva. Medikani, because the Mishnah says Yisoma. Rabbi Lazar Amar ha'ones chayva mefateh pater. Rabbi Lazar says that in the case of this Yisoma, who's so Rabbi Lazar says that the rapist would pay the 50 shekel fine and the seducer doesn't. Yisoma pshita. So the case of a Yisoma is very simple. We don't need it to be taught. So Elaha Kamashmalan, so it's teaching us the Narash and Isartim Sgarsha Ki Yisoma. That it's talking about a regular Nara who had received Kedushin, her father received Kedushin, and then she get divorced before the chuppah. She is the same halacha as an orphan. Ma Yisoma La'atzma, just like Yisoma, she keeps the fine because there is no father to receive the fine. According to Rabbi Akiva, Af Narash and Isartim Sgarsha La'atzmo. So too, a maiden who had Kedushin and got divorced before the chuppah, she gets to keep her own fine. Amar Rav Zera, Amar Rabba Bar Shela, Amar Rav Hamnuna Sava. Rav Zera said in the name of Rabba Bar Shela, who said in the name of the old Rav Hamnuna. Amar Rav Ada Bar Ava, in the name of Rav Ada Bar Ava. Amar Rav, in the name of Rav. Halacha Krabi Elazar. We pass Rabbi Elazar. Kari Rav Elazar. Tovina de Chakima. And Rav said about Rabbi Elazar, he is the nicest Tovina, like Tov, of the Chachamim. Rashi says Ma'ushar Sheba Chachamim. The way that I see Ma'ushar, the most praised of the sages, because the word Ashrei is translated. Okay, so Ashrei, praiseworthy, is translated in Targum as Tuvai. Okay, next Mishnah. Ezo Ba'oshes. So, what is the payment of humiliation that he has to that the ones and mefateh pay the maiden? So the Gemara says an important principle. Hakol afi hamavayish v'mispayesh. It depends who is the one being divorced and who is being embarrassed, and who's the one who is doing the act that humiliates you. So so what is her devaluation? What does that mean? You go to the slave market and you see how much is she worth before and how much is she worth now. Now we know that let's say if you go to the slave market, a one-armed slave is worth a lot less than a two-armed slave. So what would be the difference in her value? Here she's the same. So I guess the answer would be is that if an owner wanted to reward one of his other slaves by giving him a slave that he could be married to, so if she was a virgin, she would be worth more. My father points out that I think in OSHA, for the federal law for people who get damaged on the job, they still have valuations for injuries, for this finger, for that eye. So that idea still is in place in our time in the federal law. Yeah. No. Knas shava b'chol adam. Knas is 50 shekel. It applies for everyone. It's equally 50 shekel. It doesn't matter who the victim was, who the perpetrator was. And anything which the Torah gives a set fee for, it's the same for every person. So meaning when you get damaged, the Torah doesn't say you pay this much. If you kill an Eved, there's a fixed fee. For Bochus and Begam, it's a set fee. So it doesn't matter who it is. Someone of high stature who's causing the humiliation, someone of a lower stature, someone from a very distinguished family who's being victimized, someone from a not distinguished family, you all pay the same. Gemara, So how do we know that we pay, that the violator, the onus or the mefateh has to pay boshus ufgam? Maybe once the Torah says that you pay 50 shekel, the 50 shekel is the total amount that you pay. So Rabbi Zera says, Yom Rubal Bas Malachim Chamishim. Should we say that if he had relations with a princess, with the daughter of the king, he pays 50, Baal Bas Hedros Chamishim, and just a regular person is also 50? It can't be that that's the same. So therefore, when the Torah says 50, that must be one payment, but the actual Bosh's payment must be separate. Amarle Abaye said to Rabbi Zera, Yihachi Gabi Eved Nami. You could ask your question about a slave also. Yomru Eved Nokiv Margolio Shloshim. Should we say that if there's a very high skilled Eved, and he deals with making holes in pearls? I mean, the Nokiv Margolis means you make holes in pearls. So you're making a string of pearls, you need to make a very fine hole and not ruin the pearl to put it on a necklace. ArtScroll translates it though as cuts gems. So for that, so that's a very skilled worker. So he pays 30 for him, and Eved Osa Maisa Machat Shloshim, and if someone who just works with a needle, whether it means embroidery or whatever, but in other places, the Gemara is clear, and let's say, I think it's on Daf Yud Zayin maybe in Kedushin, when it's talking about an Eved Ivri who gets injured and can't work, what happens? But is he capable of at least doing a very easy job, this needle work? So is he also get 30 shekel? Who's a much more valuable one? The one who can deal with precious stones. Elamar Bzeira, Ilu Bala Shnaim, Echa Kedarka Vechad Shlo Kedarko, Yomru Bal Shlema Chamishim, Bal Paguma Chamishim. So what if two men raped a young woman, and one did it in the natural way, and one did it the unnatural way, Shlo Kedarka? Yomru Bal Shlema Chamishim. Should we say the one and Bal Paguma Chamishim? Should one who had relations with the Shlema, she was a whole girl, there was no deficiencies in her, will pay 50. But the one who did with the girl who was already deficient would also pay 50? That doesn't make sense. Amalei Abaye asked to him, Yihachi Gabi Eved Nami, for the 30, if an animal would gore an Eved, and that the payment is a set 30 shekel, Yomro Eved Bari Shloshim, Eved Mukashchin Shloshim, would you say a healthy Eved you pay 30, and for a Mukashchin, one who has terrible skin maladies that no one wants to be near, you're also going to say he's worth 30? El Amar Abaye, so Abaye says, Amar Kra Tachas Asher Ina. He has to pay 50 because he had relations with her. Hani Tachas Asher Ina, Bechlal Deika Boshus Ugam. The 50 because he had relations with her shows that that's only for the relations. Other things that happen, he has to pay a separate payment. The ArtScroll says something a little different. ArtScroll says the word Ina is afflicted her. But you have to be aware that the word Ina can be to afflict someone, like Inoy on Yom Kippur, the fact that we refrain from eating and drinking and washing and marital relations and rubbing in lotions and ointments, that's a form of affliction. But the word Ina also means specifically marital relations, because She'er Ksus V'Ono Solo Yigra. So it does have a different meaning, so it slightly changes. So I don't know why ArtScroll specifically used this translation. Rava gives a different answer. The man who lays with her will give the father of the young woman 50 shekel. So the pleasure that he got from laying with her is worth 50. So meaning only, so it's a similar logic, but from a different pasuk. So the fact that for laying with her is 50 shows that there are other payments that he also has to make for her. So we will leave it here. About 9 lines from the top on Mem on the base.